I'm Ben Morgan. I'm the Assistant Director for the RfPB program, of which RfSC is a part of. And I also oversee the 3 research schools, of which social care is one. So I work very closely with Martin Knapp on the School for Social Care. So quite a bit of social care activity in my part of the NIHR. So I'm going to cover a couple of things in my session. The first bit is about the call, what it's about, the rules, eligibility, how to apply. And then I'll do a little bit on advice for applicants, but I know Leamy is going to do a session after, and Leamy sits on the panel, will have a much better perspective. So I'll just cover a few high-level things that I think matters when applying for RfSC. And then I think we'll hold the questions for the session later. So RfSC, it's a relatively new call. It's run on an annual basis, and we've been given £3 million each year, and we are hoping to fund around 10 to 15 applications per round. There's a few key new things about it, or which make it distinct from the other NIHR programs. And one of the key things is that the panel which makes the committee makes the funding decisions is a national panel of social care experts. It's not a healthcare panel with a couple of social care experts on. It's fully social care experts. So the first message here is, if you apply to RfSC and you're a social care researcher, you will be assessed by your peers, and the list of panel members is online, and you can see who they are. You'll probably recognise them all, as they are well-established researchers in social care. The process, the RfSC is actually modelled on RfPB, so it looks very similar. There's a few differences. So the panel being social care experts is one, but the application process is the same. It's a 2-stage process with an outline at stage 1, and line for that is the 20th of January next year. It opened last week, I think week before last, so plenty of time if you're considering putting an application in. And if you're invited to stage 2, the deadline for that's in April. And the outcomes are later in the year, and they'll roughly be the time frame we work to each year. So if you can't get in for this call, there'll be similar time frames for the year after. So as I mentioned, it's modelled on RfPB at the RfSC program call, and therefore the funding limit is £350,000 and up to 3 years in length. I'm going to talk about a few distinctions, because there was a few questions last time about some rules RfPB has that don't apply to RfSC. So RfPB has these funding tiers, which are really good for if you're funding clinical trials, and we didn't see many. We don't expect to see many clinical trials in social care, so we've got rid of the funding tiers. But the message here is the application you're putting in, the amount you're requesting should be proportionate with the chance of achieving some sort of social care benefit. So if you're doing more, we call it upstream, but if it's more developmental, more scoping, more exploratory work, you probably shouldn't be asking for £350,000. It's probably going to be nearer could be £100,000, £200,000. Whereas if it's something which may be a full evaluation of a service and the outcomes of which could influence practice, then that's certainly much nearer the 350k limit. So you need to justify what you're doing in the context of how much you're asking for. I also wanted to make clear, one of the first questions I often get is about, are we doing children's social care as well? It's only adult social care, and you heard Martin Knapp explain why that's the case. However, there are discussions going on about how we can maybe match this up or link it up better, because it is a bit of an arbitrary split due to government requirements, government responsibility of what department's doing what part of social care. So the transition between children's and adult social care is probably the earliest in the lifetime, if you like, of the social care needs and requirements that we would look at in RfSC. However, if you have any queries, if you're not sure about your idea, if it's in remit for the call, you can put in a pre-submission query, and one of the RfSC team will get back to you and give you an idea on whether you're likely to be in scope for RfSC, or whether there's other programs or other funders which may be more appropriate. So a little bit on the assessment process. So as I said, the panel is a national panel of social care experts, but it also includes practitioners and publishers, and it's really important to make sure your research is applicable to practitioners and public members, service users, care users, and you involve them in the proposal where appropriate. We're thinking that the evidence produced from the research we fund will go into practice, will be used by practitioners. So it's a good idea to make sure that you're thinking about them when you're putting your proposal in. So these are the 3 sorts of things we need to make sure are satisfied at stage 1. So firstly, and most fundamentally, is the question, is it a relevant question? Is it relevant to care users? Is it going to add value to the existing research. And it's often the so what question. So ask yourself, so what if I don't do this research? What does it mean? If I do it, what does it mean? And it's often a good the first thing to satisfy yourself is that the question you're putting forward is actually worth answering, because if it isn't, the rest of this doesn't really apply, because this application will be triaged out fairly quickly. So is it a relevant question? And then next is, will the methods answer the question? So sometimes we see really great questions which we're desperate to see answered. The methods simply won't answer them, and that's no use equally. Or sometimes we see really poor questions which we don't want answered, but beautifully designed. And again, not much point in that. You want a good question with a good design. And the design, it could be, methods. We always often think about the type of methodology, but some of these things come down to, the outcome measures. And I think there's talking about care users. Get your care users to give a comment on outcome measures. Sometimes we see these very burdensome projects that require a huge amount of burden from the participants in the research, and it's just not practical, it's not realistic. The service users don't really care about it, and our public members will pick that up on the committee. So think about it. It's not just, are you doing this particular questionnaire or this particular interview approach? It's much more about how you involve users and care users. And then the team as well. The team must be appropriate. And I'm going to talk a bit more about the team later, but the team as a whole is assessed, and I'll explain what I mean by that later on. And then the other thing we ask our committees at stage 1 to think about is the overall competitiveness. So we generally think of things as minor, major, and fundamental flaws, and things like minor and major flaws can be fixed between stage 1 and stage 2. It could be a more justification, or actually, this part doesn't quite work, do something else. However, if there's lots and lots of minor and major flaws, they tend to become a fundamental flaw. So you might have a reasonable question and some reasonable methodology, but if there's just too much to fix, it might be better to come back at a stage 1 for the next call. So that's essentially the stage 1. If you can satisfy those 3 criteria, you're likely to get through to stage 2. The host organization is important, and it's different from RfPB, so I just want to clarify that. So RfSC, the social care part, is open to universities, local authorities, and also NHS bodies. So any of those can host the research that you're submitting to RfSC, and the bulk of which we see is universities. We'd love to see more local authorities. We generally take the view that research delivered or research conducted where care is delivered is better and adds value, but for the reasons Martin outlined, there's all sorts of reasons why local authorities struggle to host and be involved in research, but university is very welcome to apply. But must be able to fulfill the role of sponsor, which all universities will be able to do. The RfSC call is open to England-only hosts, but it is okay to collaborate outside of England, and that includes the rest of the UK and also internationally, as long as it's justified. And as I mentioned about the links with practice, it is really key that if you're doing this research, you need to have strong links with the organisations delivering care. It'd be very unusual to see a proposal that didn't have involvement from, say, local authorities, if what you're doing would have an impact on local authorities. It looks like you don't know you may not understand the topic as well as you need to, and it also reduces the chance of any findings to be implemented or taken up, because you're not working with the people that will actually be using it. So it's really important to make sure those other groups are involved appropriately. Again, we heard from Martin, social care, it's a very broad and sometimes complex thing to define. So we haven't actually defined social care. This is a response mode call. So therefore, researchers come to us for ideas and proposals and suggest the topics and how that matches in with social care. So we haven't said this is our definition of social care, you must apply according to this. We've just said all of social care is open. This is the sort of flavour a social care application may have, but if the thing you're doing isn't on this list, it doesn't mean you're necessarily excluded. It's just down to you to explain to us in the panel how your research will have some sort of social care benefit. So the sort of things we were looking at were certainly social care needs and outcomes. That seems fairly obvious, and the measures of those could be completely, could be a variety, could be at individual level, population level, could be all sorts of levels. Providing evidence for how better ways of working. There's a lot of current practice which is not evident. So providing the evidence and filling those gaps is key, and the sort of things we would expect to see at maybe the 350k tier. We're also looking to develop new ways of delivering care. Could be better ways of delivering care, cheaper ways of delivering care. That's no worse. That's absolutely fine. We see that occasionally. Secondary data analysis are great. We fund quite a few of those. Could be literature reviews as well, systematic reviews. Records linkages is something we're seeing a bit more of, and there's a wealth of data there if you can get hold of it and do the analysis. We also do research development methods, and that could be developing a new outcome measure to use in other research, or it could be something else, but methods development is also included, but tends to be down the lower end of the funding envelope, because again, the steps to social care benefit are probably a few more along, as opposed to have an immediate impact. Standard care users and needs circumstances seems an appropriate thing to do. Again, usually a bit more towards the earlier phase, because you have to then understand the needs and then develop something and then maybe test it out to show if it works. So very much down to yourselves. You need to come to us with ideas and explain and justify how these will have a social care benefit, and how you'll explain that pathway if it's a bit more of an earlier phase project. I just want to include costings because this tripped up quite a few people in the first round. And going back to Martin's point, NIHR does use a lot of health terminology. We use words like patients and clinical and treatment, which I appreciate isn't the language that social care research uses. And we're slowly getting it right and changing the words, but sometimes there's some things which are sort of standard terms which we are still trying to change. So I want to include this because we had a couple in the first round where treatment costs, everyone just said, we don't provide treatments, this is social care, we're not providing drugs or surgical techniques, therefore there are no treatment costs, which is accurate in that regard, but these costs are more to describe activity. So there's three broad research costs. The research costs, which are provided by the funder, i.e. RfSC. There's support costs, which are generally for things like recruiting participants into research, and those are provided by the CRN. And then there's treatment costs, which we can probably call intervention or service costs or care costs, and those are provided by whoever's providing that particular care. So it could be a local authority, it could be a third sector organisation, it could be the NHS. So don't look at these and go, well, I don't need to worry about support and treatment costs. Think of it as activity, because if you get these wrong, it can really undermine your application, which I'll explain a bit later. I've done a quick worked example, the sort of thing we might see in RfSC. So let's just say you're proposing something which involves interviewing users' needs on a piece of assistive technology for people with dementia in a care home. Seems like the sort of thing we might get in RfSC. So in this case, the interviews would be research activity because they're required for the research. They're finished at the end of the project. You probably won't interview people indefinitely afterwards. And those costs you'll need to add up to the funder, to the RfSC column. The consenting and recruiting participants to be part of that research project would be a support cost, and that would typically be funded by the CRN. And then the assistive technology itself would be the treatment cost in this case, and that would be funded by the organisation, so the care home in this case. Now, that's a relatively straightforward question. It can be a bit more tricky if you've got more complex research going on, but the reason this is important is because what tends to happen is treatment and support costs get added into the research cost, and it looks like your research then is poor value for money. And that's why it's really important to get these costs right. Otherwise, you kind of undermine yourself before you put your application in. If you're struggling with this, you can speak to the RfSC team. The RDS can help, but the CRN actually have these people called accord specialists who specialize in costing up research grants. So if you're doing anything that's involved in recruiting participants, speak to the CRN and they can help you cost up the grants. Going back to the scope of the call, I thought it'd be good just to give a quick snapshot of a few applications we've previously funded. So we funded 20 applications to date, a range of methodologies and topics. So I'm not going to read through all of these individually, but you can see the topics are quite varied, the methods are quite varied, and that's probably the message I want to say is as long as it's social care related and you've justified that, we really don't mind what the topics or the methods are. If it's qualitative, fine. If it's mixed methods, fine. If you want to do a phase 3 RCT, fine. You can do whatever you want as long as it's justified and explained how there'll be a social care benefit. And all of these projects are online. If you want to look at all 20, you can see who's been funded, what we funded, and actually we're going to be hearing from one of the funded applicants from a previous round later. So the last call, we had 36 stage ones, of which 17 were invited to stage 2, and of which 8 were funded. So generally, we try to work that every researcher that applies will have a 1 in 2 chance of being invited to stage 2, and if you get to stage 2, you have a 1 in 2 chance. That's roughly what we try to work to. So it's a bit lower than last time, 22% overall success rate. But these are reasonably good success rates in the grand scheme of things. Many other programs or funders often are in the mid to high teens of success rate. So it's a reasonable chance of success. But one thing I wanted to mention is that we have £3 million per call, and we were only able to spend just over £2 million of it. So the message from me is we've got money. It's not a case of we've got lots of high quality proposals which we're having to decline due to budget constraints. It's absolutely the other way around. So good ideas will get funded, and we do have money there. So if you submit and it's a good proposal, you will get funded. I'm going to quickly go through some of these, but I won't go into too much detail because I know Limi will cover these in more detail later. But these are the sort of things which I see sitting on these panels, and the sort of things which need to be addressed to make sure it's competitive. So as I mentioned, the clear question, a key rationale for the question is vital. The benefit of how it will have social care impact and all that path to impact is key. Methods is key. The team needs to be convincing, but it doesn't have to be a highly senior team, which I'll speak about later. And then that involvement and inclusion of the practitioners and care workers, care users, really does need to be done well. So the question, why does it matter? And it's the so what question. Sometimes it's unclear why this is even needed. Why is this proposal even here? It's really down to you to explain it. What people affected, what's the potential improvement that your research will have, is there any costs associated? Put this in the background and explain the context, because although the panel reviewing the applications are social care experts, they may not necessarily be someone on the panel who knows your particular patch to the level that you do. So you need to explain it to the panel. And then that trajectory is key. So if you are doing earlier phase work, for example, and you're asking for 50k, 100k, the chances are you won't have an immediate impact. If you need to do a second piece of research, or there's another piece afterwards, explain what that may look like and how you're planning to get there. Because if it just ends abruptly with we'll identify something, but we won't do anything about it, it's not really a compelling case for improving social care practice. And the team is really important to get right. So there's a few things which often get missed here. So the team needs to be appropriately resourced. Don't over or under cost it. Committees will spot that. Sometimes we see people included and it's not clear what they're doing. They're being there at 30% FTE, but they don't appear to be doing anything. That doesn't look good. Equally, sometimes there's someone in there at 5% who appears to be doing the entire project. And again, we don't want to overwork the people. We want to make sure they're well resourced and have the time to do it. What doesn't go down well is just listing senior colleagues at 1%. And I know it's tempting to put the most senior professor you can find on and say, look, no, this person's going to help out. But I think 1% is about 22 a week. I'm not sure how useful that's going to be. I think panels would rather see appropriate people appropriately costed, as opposed to just a list of very senior names from people we know are far too busy to do anything useful in these particular projects. And in early career, we certainly encourage early career researchers to lead the research, a bit like RfPB. It very much encourages the sort of more earlier junior research, whatever you want to call the term, to be the lead applicant. And what we ask our panels to do is to assess the team as a whole. We don't say judge the lead applicant on their record of research. In fact, many times in RfPB, and we're trying to see in RfSC, this could be a good first award, a first step from maybe a smaller award or a fellowship into a sizable grant. So if you've not held a big grant before, it doesn't matter, that won't count against you. But you must have an appropriate team around you. And perhaps if you are early career, have it clear that one of the co-applicants will be a member who's supporting you, who's mentoring you, and can give you all that overview you need. And there's a chance to be a joint PI as well. If you need to be a joint PI, that's absolutely fine. So just going on a bit more in depth, so we expect to see multidisciplinary teams in our applications. It'd be odd to have just a team of I don't know, completely comprised of academics, social workers. You'd expect to see the appropriate methodologists in there. If you need a health economist, if you need a statistician, a qualitative expert, put them in. And as I mentioned, I can't emphasize enough, excuse me, early career researchers do need to be supported with a convincing team. And RDS can help you here. If you need help trying to compile the right team, the RDS can be a good resource for this. Just a little bit on the feedback, what does or doesn't work out well sometimes. So I won't go, these are the sorts of things that I expect Limi will cover in a bit more detail. But these are the reasons why things fail sometimes. And most commonly, it's the rationale for social care benefit and the detail in the methods. They're quite often the fundamental flaws, and the RDS can help avoid this. So I won't go over these in lots of detail because I know Limi will cover some of these in a bit more detail. So this is probably the biggest reason is the impact is the trajectory to demonstrate the importance is not there. And then a few other things which just make the application look poor. Sometimes we see critical literature not mentioned. It may look like you're not up to speed with what's going on in the topic in the research area. It just makes it look a bit naive perhaps. Or if the research team are lacking expertise, sometimes we see people say, oh, I'm going to do all the methods part, but you probably need an established methodologist to do those. And then the pathway to impact is really important, and then often the thing which makes the early upstream type research struggle, because it's not clear what the next steps are. If you're doing a full evaluation of a service, that often will be clear that will have some particular impact potentially. But if you're doing the earlier phase work, that's often the one where you need to be clear that step 2, 3, 4 will look like whatever it will look like. And then I just want to finish up on the plain English summary. So this is something which is sort of a personal view of mine. I think the importance of the plain English summary is hugely underrated. Just to be clear, you won't get funded or rejected based on the quality of the plain English summary, but put yourself in the perspective of the committee. The committee will get 36 applications to read, a lot of work to read. The first thing they read of every application is the plain English summary. I like to think of it, it's almost like your covering letter to your CV. It's the way to explain what's going to happen and what's going to be done. In two things you need to get right: plain English. So sometimes I read plain English summaries and I have no idea what's going on. I have no idea what it's about, no idea what the topic's about, terms I don't understand. And then all that does is make me dread reading the technical summary, because if I can't understand the plain English summary, I have absolutely no chance of understanding the technical and complex parts of the application. So get that right, and you can check these. You can give it to someone, a family member who doesn't know anything about the topic, ask them if they understand it. If they don't, you need to rewrite it. And then the other thing to get right is make it accurate. Quite often plain English summaries sort of embellish to some extent what's going to be done, particularly for the earlier phase work. So I find it a bit frustrating if I read a plain English summary and it sounds like it's perhaps a full evaluation, and then when you read it, it's actually not, it's early development work. So I think you can put the panel member and your assessors in a relatively good mood if you have a plain English summary that is plain and accurate, and it sets up the rest of the assessment of the application. So I don't want to over-egg the importance of the plain English summary, but it's the first thing anybody reads, and it's often the last thing that gets written and put in at the last minute. So spend time on this and get your service user or public member to read it and spend time to make sure it's accurate.